On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we speak with Dr. Alex Plato, an associate professor of philosophy at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and a significant thinker in the areas of moral philosophy, Catholic social teaching, and G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc's Distributism.
All right.
Well, hello once again, viewers and listeners, to another episode of Uncommon Sense. My name is Joe Grabowski, the Vice President for Evangelization and Mission here at the Society. Joined as always by my wonderful co-host, Grettelyn Darkey. Hi, Grettelyn.
Hi there, Joe.
And we have with us a very great honor today, Alex Plato from Franciscan University. Hi, Alex.
How you doing, guys? Good to see you.
Very good, thanks. So, Alex, we've met a couple of times at the New Polity Conference out there in Steubenville, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the kind of content and ideas floating around there at that shop. But just for our viewers and listeners, why don't you give just a basic background of who you are and what your interests are?
Okay. How far back do I go here? Well, I grew up in Oregon in a very small town that has more cows than people. And I have a twin brother who I know at least you know, Joe, who's a Chesterton Academy professor, founder, headmaster. I grew up in that really small town called Lakeview, Oregon. I was raised a Christian. I was raised a Protestant Christian. My father, I actually found out in a strange situation later on in life, a couple of years ago, that he had actually been baptized. I did not know that he had been baptized my whole life, so I thought he was a heathen. But he had been baptized, but he had never practiced the faith in my whole life. And I had a lot of arguments and debates with him about evolution when I was in high school. I was raised in a kind of Baptist fundamentalist sort of tradition in which creationism was sort of like the enemy of evolutionism. And that was kind of a front for really my interests, which were apologetical and like, well, does God exist? If my dad doesn't really believe there's a God, well, then how's he going to be a creationist, you know? So I got in all kinds of debates that kind of got me interested in philosophy, which I eventually pursued in my undergraduate days. I pursued philosophy, and then I went and did a master's degree at Biola University in LA. If people don't know, it used to stand for Bible Institute of Los Angeles, but it became a kind of liberal arts, conservative evangelical institution. And then in 2007, I went to a conference on Dietrich von Hildebrand's philosophy at Franciscan University. I kind of encountered it for the first time, and I remember thinking, this is exactly like Biola University, although there's priests and nuns walking around. They're playing guitar and they're singing the same songs. So I felt the ecumenical warmth there. I subsequently went to St. Louis University after finishing a master's degree at Biola. The Talbot School of Theology was their graduate program, with a MA in philosophy was. And I went to St. Louis University, and after a year there, I had become a Catholic. An inquiry into Catholicism had started many years before that, and became a Catholic at St. Louis University and worked on my dissertation with Greg Beabout, who was my advisor. He does Kierkegaard, MacIntyre, Catholic social teaching. My dissertation was all about Elizabeth Anscombe and her philosophy. So my expertise is really moral philosophy, and specifically Elizabeth Anscombe, and specifically Elizabeth Anscombe's moral philosophy, and specifically Anscombe's most famous essay on moral philosophy called Modern Moral Philosophy, which is one of the most famous essays in Anglo-American philosophy in the last 100 years. It's been anthologized many times. There's been, celebrations of it pretty much every decade. People are still commenting on it, and I had a certain angle and take on it. And so that was really my launch into my career as a professor. Then I got a job here at Franciscan University. So I was here in 2007. I got the job here in 2014 and started teaching in the spring of 2015. And I've been here ever since, and I love it. I love my department. I love the students. It's just a great environment to be, and I get to, follow my dream of being a professor. So I get to teach philosophy. And I met when I was here, you mentioned New Polity. When I was here at some point along the road, I met some of the key people of New Polity. I met Jacob Imam. I had met Andrew Jones actually before in St. Louis because he was a student there, but in history, and I was in philosophy. And I didn't really know him that well, but we actually crossed paths at the same parish. And And then he was here, and so I got to know him and Jacob Imam, Mark Barnes, the New Polity people, and I became a fellow of New Polity, and I just love those guys. They're really good friends of mine. So I kind of have my foot in kind of two worlds, like Franciscan with, the philosophy department and philosophy in that world of college, and then I have my foot in the world with New Polity and what they do and stuff. So that's kind of who I am roughly. Happy to answer any other questions about anything. There's lots of tangents we could have taken along that little rendition.
Yeah, well, my immediate thought goes to just sort of the ideal of the university, right? And what's happening there in Steubenville is really something that, gets paid a lot of lip service, even within the liberal academy, which is interdisciplinary studies and things like that. And what you really find at your major, huge universities is that all of that is kind of a little bit of fakery, a little bit of, you write your abstract to try to make sure that you're cross-referencing other fields of study, but there's no real engagement with ideas. And just thinking of what I know of Steubenville, the community, both at the university, but also within the community, like at New Polity, you do have historians, economists, philosophers, theologians, integrating and really talking through issues in this holistic way. And, as Chestertonians and running the Chesterton Schools Network about integrated curriculum, that's something that really strikes me as important. Do you find that kind of atmosphere at Steubenville is, if not unique, at least pretty special?
I think it is both special and unique. I mean, There's other places that share that value. But I think overall in Western civilization, I think the wisdom tradition is no longer central to education, and the way in which that tradition is passed on is through the liberal arts method and the liberal arts way of doing things. Like you talked about many different disciplines which relate to each other and really teach us, like Dorothy Sayers said in her famous essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, that when she talked about the trivium, like it gives us the tools for learning. And then when we go on to the further studies, which university is more like the quadrivium, right? You're learning how to think about the basic principles of reality from all these different angles. So you have an integrated perspective, a world that is coherent and articulated and able to be creative when creativity is needed, and able to look to the past and what's proven when needed, and be able to live in that center of that wisdom. And so to me, the philosophical life and the philosophical quest is really a name for that in a generic sense. Now, of course, I'm a specialist in philosophy, like I teach philosophy classes, but if you read Dante's poetry, that's philosophical. If you read Belloc's history, that's philosophical, right? So there's kind of a philosophy in a broad sense, and the liberal arts is trying to get us to be like that. I mean, in the sense of philosophers are lovers of wisdom, right? That's what the term means. So to get students to love wisdom, like we're doing the best we can here at Franciscan, and I think doing a unique and excellent job. And I think that is the name of the game in terms of, I think, both being a distributist, that's essential, but just being, I think, a faithful member of our Western tradition, and specifically the Catholic tradition, which really is the center of our tradition, our civilization. And so now I think it's a privilege, it's a unique thing, and I hope to see it more. And it's just something we could talk about just alone, let alone get to talk about distributism. But it has an integral, intimate relationship to that tradition. Distributism does.
Could you speak more to that? So how does distributism play into that sort of holistic view of life?
Yeah, no, I think that, I've read distributist stuff for a while, and I've read traditional stuff like the classical distributists, like Chesterton and Belloc, McNabb. And I've also read like contemporary figures, like John Mackay, for example, and also contemporary critics. And what I find in a lot of the contemporary discussions is a kind of narrow view of distributism, where distributism is kind of focused on economics, and it's all about economic reforms and economic policies. And maybe they even call distributism like an economic model, whatever that's supposed to be, or an economic system, whatever that's supposed to be, right? As if it's trying to replace, right, some sort of thing like our holy economic structure, right? And I think that that's a mistake. I don't think distributism should be reduced to an economic policy, let alone an economic model or an economic system. Now, certainly it has stuff to say about economics. There's no doubt about that. I mean, think about Belloc's book, Economics for Helen, And it's certainly many of the central concepts of the distributists. The thing that gave them their war cry, right, is we need property to be well distributed among families so that society can be healthy again. And the center of their reform has to do with concepts like property. But a concept like property, as any economist knows, is a much more complicated concept than the dismal science can treat of, right? It overlaps with that, but it also concerns the very nature of man, like anthropology, and of course, sociology, the nature of society, which gets us into the common good and ethics and philosophy and theology and cosmology, and all of a sudden it's really broad, right?
Yeah.
So what I find is Belloc, for example, in his book, Crisis of Civilization, or Crisis of Our Civilization, he calls it, which was based on some lectures he gave in 1937 at Fordham University. And in that series of lectures of that book, he, in the final chapter, it's called Restoration of Our Civilization. And he gives one of the most, I think, comprehensive, but in outline kind of overview form, like distributism widely conceived. But what's fascinating about this chapter is that it's in the context of what we would call like Catholic culture building. So he says in that chapter, he says, if we don't build a Catholic culture and revive the Catholic spirit in our civilization, and he talks a lot about what that would do and what that's like and how we would measure it, so to speak. He said, if we don't do that, all of these distributive reforms are totally futile. I mean, it's that important. He says this is absolutely fundamental. And so that's the part, I think, that isn't often understood by critics who get focused on the economics and want to nitpick Belloc or nitpick Chesterton about their economics. And I just think that's kind of missing the big point. So that's why I'm interested in what I'm going to be, I coined for myself anyway, post-liberal distributism. So the post-liberal element is like there's a fundamental critique of our liberal modern world, right? Both in terms of its political forms and its economic forms, or maybe I could say more broadly, its political and economic habits, like the systemic features of our politics and our economics. It's a critique of that, I think, down to the ground, which is what the post-liberals of various sorts, and there's a lot of kinds of them out. It's a kind of hot topic. But the kinds I'm thinking of are the kinds that are my friends at New Polity. So there's kind of a New Polity version of Catholic post-liberalism. And it wants to distinguish itself from maybe more popular post-liberals like Patrick Deneen, right, and Adrian Vermeule, which are now really in the limelight because J.D. Vance was just chosen as the VP. And he has explicit interest in Deneen's philosophy. Deneen's an interesting story because his earlier work in 2018, his famous book, Why Liberalism Failed, is very much compatible with what I think New Polity is interested in. But he kind of shifted as he went along. But so New Polity wants to say, look, we like a lot of their policies, we like suggestions, a lot of what they do, but their underlying philosophical vision isn't the same as us. It is post-liberal, so it wants to radically replace liberal theory and practice. So it's post-liberal in that sense, but they want to distinguish it from that. I think Belloc's distributism is the most simpatico with that New Polity vision that I see. There's other post-liberals too out there that are worth talking about, but I think that fundamental cultural element, which is based on the centrality of the faith, right? And he even says, like, it was our faith, it was the Catholic spirit that made our society back in the pre-modern times distributist. That's what made it the right order, right? The right balance. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't heading for devastation like ours is.
Yes.
It had the right balance, the right proportion of productive property distributed among families. And it had a different set of institutions that ensured that. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, well, within that framework, I guess, could you give this is going to be a trick, but can you give like a brief, like nutshell definition of what you would call distributism then? Because, I often hear it as an economic theory. I've heard all the things that you're saying, but like, how would you define it very briefly within all of that framework, if you could?
I know. I think the best, whenever we try to make a definition, a philosopher, right, there's a genus, right, that you want to locate something. Then you want to say specifically how it's different than other things in that same genus or class.
Okay.
Lots of times people say, well, it's not capitalism and it's not socialism, right? And people treat those as if those are economic systems. So then distributism has to be an economic system that's now distinguishable from those two. But really, those are deeper ideas, capitalism and socialism. And so one term that people have tried to use, like the recent thinker Alexander Salter. He's a guy at CUA. He wrote a book called The Political Economy of Distributism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the concept of political economy is trying to get broader, right, than just an economic model or economic system, to bring in politics and our social order more broadly. And I don't think that's even broad enough, because when you think about culture, like Belloc did, that's necessary. Culture is as broad as you can get. Reflect on the most famous Catholic historian, I think, probably of modern times, which is Christopher Dawson,
Mm-hmm.
right? Christopher Dawson says that, the culture is the form of the society, and the culture and the religion are always one. And so ultimately the root of history and the root of civilization is religion, right? Our orientation towards God, which is, any classical philosopher can know that, right? It's our ultimate end, right? That determines everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that distributism should not be thought of as an economic system or economic model or economic policy, but distributism is a social philosophy, right? It's a social philosophy that includes culture, faith, theology, sociology, anthropology, economics, politics. It's broader. It's as broad as Catholic social teaching. Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's where it came from, and that's what Nimbit's in. So, and I think it's even broader now. So think about a social philosophy that's been around for a really long time. It's had like maybe a weekly journal for many decades, then it has like maybe a monthly journal, and then maybe it has like societies that are attached to it. It has thinkers like over 100 years, which identify as part of the same group. Now it's not just a social philosophy, it's a tradition of social philosophy. So distributism is a tradition of thought and practice. So it's a much broader term. And I think if we start thinking of it that way, then I think that distributism should and ought to be one of the major focuses of discussions among Catholics, right? Especially in our English-speaking world. I mean, there's a lot of other movements in other countries that have different languages at their basis. And I'm not very proficient in other languages, but I understand the English inheritance, right? And I love Chesterton and I love Belloc, and I think they have a lot of great ideas. And of course, within a tradition, you're going to criticize things. That's what a tradition does, right? It's trying to constantly hone and sharpen its ideas and apply them creatively as time goes on. So to me, it's much broader than economics, but includes it.
Yeah, it's a very well put point. And, over the years of my participation with the Chesterton Society, back to the days when it was the American Chesterton Society and we had our annual conference, there was always a panel or a workshop or a talk, angled in at Chesterton's sort of socio-economic thought. And it was always the most controversial, because you have a lot of Chestertonians who come to it and they love Chesterton's thought, they say, but they want to leave this kind of part of it aside. And my contention has always been that you can no more leave this aside than you can leave his Catholicism aside, or his commitments regarding any number of first principles. It's just, they were integral thinkers, not integralist, but integral thinkers. Belloc and Chesterton, they had a whole vision, and you have to kind of read their different discrete ideas within the contexts of the other things that they're working on. So it's well observed that this isn't just a political or a social philosophy, because if you made it such, you're always just begging the question. If you say, well, property, even in Leo the 13th, property should be widely distributed. Well, why, right? That you have to have, there's an anthropological premise that's maybe unstated or inchoate, but there's something of theological anthropology undergirding this. There's some sort of value of freedom and rights, which is maybe distinct from the rights of the Enlightenment or the way they're conceived. But all of that has to come along. And so, I've met people who say, well, isn't that just a tired old idea? Is there really anything left to talk about in that tradition? I'm like, there's more to talk about now than there ever has been before, because of course there is, because more and more people have been writing and thinking about it. So, but not only that, we haven't even begun, in my opinion, to mine the richness of the let's say, originating sources, the source
I
material.
agree with that. And I think what I would call the post-liberalism of distributism is an angle to see that, because the post-liberals that at New Polity, for example, like it's the theological anthropology, right, has been distorted. I mean, if you return to, and speaking to Catholics now, if you return to Vatican II, right, and we're called to this Christian humanism, right, and the church is the harbinger through the incarnation of true humanity. And so there's been a corruption of humanity itself, right? We've been trying to, as Chesterton said, we've been trying to, make our soul, push it into the social order's form, as opposed to, right, let it be informed by God's order, right?
Mhm.
And so we're distorting our very nature, right, and our very way of being humans. And so the personalism of JP2 is another name for the same thing, right? There's a deep idea about mankind needs to be mankind again, right? I mean, you can see nowadays in the radical wokeism and transgenderism and transhumanism, like we are trying to make ourselves the way we think will be better than the way God made us,
Yep.
right? And so there's this like fundamentally diabolical technocratic push to make ourselves, to control our own destinies, whereas we know the traditional philosophy, not just Christian philosophy, but Western philosophy more generally, and Eastern philosophy. I mean, I could think of Confucius on this point, right? Is like there is an end, right? There's a goal, and that goal has to be the goal of us within nature or creation, which has itself a goal. There's a cosmic goal, okay? And if there is such a cosmic goal, then we have to pursue that cosmic goal or live in such a way as to achieve that. Mm-hmm. And if you're a transhumanist, there is no such ultimate goal. If you're a liberal like Hobbes explicitly says there is no such architectonic good, right? Well, if there isn't, then yeah, anything goes. Pick whatever good you want. You want health, you want security, you want safety, right? What do you want? You want some luxuries, you want some combination of those. That's the modern era, right? We lost track of the fundamental Boethian point, right? That the good is what everything's looking at, which just goes back to Plato. Yeah. And so I think when we lose that orientation, then anything goes. You can make yourself whatever you want. And the liberal paradigm now becomes a self-destructive bomb, right? Because when people start to get away from that end, they do whatever they want, and it will ultimately destroy them, right? And destroy us.
Yeah, it seems like very Chestertonian as well, because a huge theme in Chesterton is always, if you don't conform to reality, you become insane, right? And I think that's kind of what we're seeing with this sort of self-making craze that is in so many things. Like you just named a few of them, but there's even more. People trying to make themselves and make reality conform to them instead of conforming to reality. Yeah, it's the line where he says, you may think you're a duck, but you're not a duck. Someone needs to just sort of wake you up and tell you what's true and what's real.
No, that's a really good point, Grettelyn. I hadn't thought of that, the connection to the lunatic chapter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the poet puts his head into the heavens and he's sane, and the logician, the like morbid logician, the rationalist, or the technocratic man, right, is trying to put everything inside of his mind, and he goes insane and he goes nuts, right? And that the true health is like based on the mystery of the world, right, and the mystery of man and the mystery of us before God. And I think that was a brilliant connection. I hadn't thought of that, but that is right on.
Yeah, and on sort of the flip side, you have, because Chesterton Distributism, I think Catholic social teaching, it's not necessarily, in media virtus stat, right? It's not necessarily saying it's a middle road. I understand the the concerns or the critiques that come against the idea of promoting this as a third way, let's say, rather than as a totally other way or a higher way or a more fundamental way. But it does very, very often just stand opposed simultaneously to two extremes, as I think the church often does. So while it is true that, you have to conform yourself to reality and you have to conform yourself to God's will, on the other hand, what Chesterton and Belloc constantly came back to is that in the project of building up society, in the project of building up the polis, it has to be human scale. You start with the fundamental fact of the family and of man and his normal proclivities and desires. And Chesterton famously, you alluded to it when he says that if a house is built so as to knock a man's head off every time he walks in the door, the house is built wrong. And he calls it the huge modern heresy of trying to change the human soul to fit society rather than changing society to fit the human soul. And so this is also something that I see in so much of the liberal thinking that there is out there. And when I say liberal, viewers and listeners, I don't mean, D versus R. I mean really the whole kit and caboodle of modern life and society, liberal in the classical sense, that value is precisely what they were fighting about. And I often like to quote the motto, not a lot of people know of this, the motto of the 1930 World's Fair, which was not a socialist affair at all, but the motto was, science finds, industry applies, man conforms. And that was regarded as a hopeful and futuristic message. So just think about that. So that's 1930. So that's what Chesterton and Belloc are up against. It's those sorts of currents of futurism and thinking that they're responding to in kind of the heyday of this writing corpus.
I agree with that. And, when I like to kind of spell out distributism, the framework of the distributist social philosophy, right, which is a tradition, and there's like little interpretations along the way, but there's big points. We mentioned the first, which is the aim is to make society healthy again so that families, right, will be able to flourish. Families are societies. Families are the basic units. Families are the, measure really of the health of a society. And so we got to aim at that. Of course, what a family is not a mere economic question, right?
Yeah.
It goes down to the very roots of politics, economics, culture, theology, religion. So that's the end. The end is to restore the health of our society again, not to make a utopia that's never been made, but to restore the way that used to be healthy. So like Chesterton said once famously that, the best test of possibility is actuality. So we've actually had distributist societies before. So it's not utopian. Whereas whenever I talk to a card-carrying capitalist, I feel like they have become utopian, right? Because as soon as you start critiquing the capitalist order itself that history has given us, with all of its cronyism, with its basically inevitable cronyism, that inevitably expands, right, because of its connection to the modern state or the eternal alliance of Hudge and Gudge. So then you point out those critiques, you're like, well, maybe that's a systemic feature of what you call a capitalist order. And they say, well, no. We just need to adjust the regulations in the right way. We just need to pursue freedom and entrepreneurship and all that stuff again. And then they talk about values. Now all of a sudden they're talking about the values of capitalism and not the actual order itself. So the thing they want's never been achieved. The thing the distributist wants has already been achieved. Right. And we know, as Chesterton and Belloc said, is it's based on, right, our civilizational common good, right? Our civilizational common good includes the faith, right? Includes the Catholic spirit and the Catholic culture of justice. And so we have to go back to that. And so the family, right, it is nested in that social order and was protected. It's not perfect, right? But it was protected. And that social order is the normal, natural, healthy social order, as Belloc said, even apart from our Christian inheritance. In other civilizations, you can see that.
Yeah.
And then I talk about, so that's the aim. Then I talk about the enemies, right? The enemies of the distributist order, and that using Chesterton's funny names. I love them, Hudge and Gudge, right? So you've got big business and big government. And then later on at Chesterton, I don't remember who wrote this now. I saw a blog, but they named this other one Sludge. So there's Hudge, Gudge, and Sludge. And Sludge is what you just mentioned, Joe. It's that technocratic paradigm, right? That science will achieve, industry will technocratically apply, right? And we will conform to this beautiful, wonderful, progressive era where we have, no disease. And it's literally the Enlightenment dream of Condorcet, Descartes, right? These famous thinkers. And then to me, the modern state, right, is just part of that technocratic dream. So the very kind of statecraft we have, whether we're, and Belloc has an essay about this that I write on, called the Catholic Church in the Modern State. And he talks about how the modern state is a form, right, that it could be oligarchic, it could be democratic, it could be a constitutional republic, that doesn't matter. The modern state is a form that has to do with the nature of authority, right, the nature of political authority. And the nature of political authority in this view came out of the Peace of Westphalia, right? And that's that the state, right, is superior at the very top. It's a one single supreme authority that's undividable, unshareable, unbrookable. And so that's called sovereignty in political philosophy nowadays. And so Belloc said, wow, because of the doctrine of sovereignty, the Catholic Church is necessarily incompatible with this. And this kind of statecraft is necessarily unjust, right? Because it says there's supreme authority, right, within a territory, but it doesn't have supreme authority over morals, over spiritual things. That's crazy, right? And so it's already a lie. It's unable, it's impossible to actually be a sovereign state according to its own definition, because there's no authorization for doing unjust things. Right. So when we think about, pro-abortion laws, the pro-life movement for a long time, wanted to, and still does want to get rid of it. Right. But the fundamental critique, right, is not just that we need to change the law, but we need to convince everybody that it never could have been a law. It's impossible for that to have ever been authorized by any political authority. It wouldn't have been a political authority. It would have been a mafia boss or a tyrant. That's the only thing that can, quote, authorize that. Right. And so you've got Hudge, Gudge, and Sludge. And Sludge to me is the foundational one, because he in a way is the creation of the modern state. The modern state is a technocratic invention, right? And to me, the market system, and I don't mean by that the values that our capitalist friends care about, like freedom and entrepreneurship and creativity and small business and all that. That's wonderful, right? I don't mean that. So what I mean is the market system is the fundamental order of economy and the habits of doing it. Think about Belloc and Chesterton, how much they railed against the idea of usury. Like, most people don't even know what that means. And yet that has been a position, it's an intrinsically wrong action that has always been condemned by the church, right? But we have forgotten what that even means. And if you look into the history of that term, look into the scholarship like I've done, right? Usury, just like Belloc said in many works, it was a concept that became literally attacked by Protestants and liberals and ultimately thrown away. Well, what is the concept of usury? You're like, what is that even? Right? Well, back when you're in a pre-modern economy, it's really easy to understand, right? Because if somebody gives you a loan, right, and the loan is just for you to consume, right, for you to spend on food or something, right? And the guy says, I'm going to loan you $100, and when you use that up, I want $150 back. So I want some interest, right? And that's impossible to justify. You're asking for more back than you gave him. So that's not equal. So it's unjust. And that makes sense, because in that society, the money was just consumed, right? But in our society, all money is capital. Even the money you put in the bank, there is no like pure money anymore, because it's in this system. So the entire system makes old school usury invisible. Yeah. But if you look at the system, if you zoom out and you look at the 30,000 foot view and you ask yourself, are we usurious? Right? Do we want to make money without having any grounds for making it? We just want it. You're like, well, that's obvious. Look at our debt. You've got the federal debt, which is astronomical, but that's not all the debt to it. You add the state debt. Each state has its own, and then add the private sector and add all that. And you're like, is all that debt that we took, is that all supposed to be financial capital that has led to real productivity and therefore has a justification? Or is huge swaths of it mere consumption, right? So we are systemically usurious. And yet that concept is a pre-liberal concept that liberals don't even talk about. It's like irrelevant to them. And my favorite philosopher, Anscombe, wrote about that once. And she says, and she investigated, why is it that modern economists find the concept just utterly baffling? It's because our economic order is so different than the pre-modern economic order that you can't even see usury.
Yeah. Our very consumptiveness and consumerism becomes itself a commodity and a product that drives wealth production, and it's so fitting in a certain way that you almost have to see the hand of either diabolical deceit or divine providence and the permissive will of God behind this, because it's almost too on the nose that in the very era where this reaches its sort of apogee, we come up with these new technologies that literally make us the product, like Facebook and things like that, where simply our eyes on a screen become this tool for the huge velocity of massive amounts of wealth all around our economy without anything having been produced in the process.
You're right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. The concept of the market is like we live inside of a giant market. Whereas if you understand markets in like a medieval way, it's like a little place in the middle of a city that you go to and then it disbands, right? It's like a place, or like a farmer's market, right? But now everything is a market. And if we exist in a market, then we are commodities, right? And so that's an extension, I think, of Karl Polanyi's famous critique of the market system, right? Which is the market system treats things as commodities that aren't commodities. And so now people call them, even they have the name of fictional commodities, right? So labor becomes a commodity, right? But labor is actually inseparable. That's JP2 in social teaching. It's inseparable from man, right? So you can't actually, except in your mind, can you abstract it. But if we're constantly abstracting it from man and then we're treating it a certain way, in reality, what we're doing is treating human beings a certain way. So we're then treating humans as commodities. And of course, that's a famous problem in the history of capitalism, which generated one of the worst problems, right? Which is socialism and communism. That's a reaction, right, to this abuse. And so then he says we treat not only labor as if it's a commodity, and it's not, so it's a fictional commodity, right? We treat land as if it's a commodity. Of course, we can do things to land, but we didn't make land, right? We didn't make resources, right? We didn't make oil.
Yeah.
So
Or
when we have
water.
land, right, we treat them as commodities, right?
Yeah.
Because we have to put it into a supply and demand chart to make economic calculations, to make our decisions based on the science of economics. And then lastly, and we mentioned this earlier implicitly, is money. Money is treated as if it's a commodity, but it's not a commodity. So we treat them as if they're commodities. So now everything being a commodity, everything can be subject to this quantifiable scientific manipulation. So the market system itself is a technocratic invention too. And that's what I mean by saying sludge is basic. So Hudge and Gudge are actually like children of sludge. And sludge is this diabolical impulse to control our destiny, to make our humanity what we want. That's what Satan does, right? The diabolical is the opposite of the symbolical, right? So the symbol's joining, the diabolical's dividing, right? And so Satan wants to make his social world over here, and it's not in God's world. He doesn't want God's world. And so we're going to create one over here. And that's what the technocratic world does. It creates a social world that is detached from reality. It's different from reality. It's a fiction. But the scary thing is, the more we act as if something is true, the more it starts to become true. So when we treat man like a commodity, man becomes a commodity. And so that's slavery. That's Belloc's servile state thesis, right? There it is. It's so I think distributism isn't a third way, to jump back to that point. I know what the encyclical writers meant by that, right? But with what Belloc clearly spelled out, is that there's only two ways, right? There's like the Christian way, the way of Christ, and there's the Antichrist way. Those are the only two ways in history. Now, theology can get us sped up to that conclusion really quick. But even philosophy points that direction, because there's one end. There's one ultimate end that mankind will be satisfied by achieving, and that's union with God himself. So there ultimately is, right, the way that does that and the way that pretends to but doesn't do that. So there's only two ways in the end. And Belloc's book, I was reading Joseph Pierce's biography of Belloc, sorry. And he was talking about Belloc's book, Survivals and New Arrivals, which I read that years ago, and before I even knew of such a thing as post-liberalism. And I went back to it for this paper I've been working on. And Pierce said this book is to Belloc what Mere Christianity was to Lewis, or Everlasting Man was to Chesterton. It was like his apologetical, tour de force. And when you look at that, it's just about the old enemies of Catholicism and the new enemies of Catholicism. It's like Catholic culture versus anti-Catholic culture, right? And so that should be, to me, part of the distributist playbook or, strategy as well. It's like, and he spells out the like tactical and strategic map, right, for how to address the lack of Catholic culture and how to build Catholic culture in the three different environments in which Catholicism finds itself in the Western world, like a Protestant environment, an old Catholic environment, or an Orthodox environment. Those are the only three within Western civilization. So how are you going to this is what he said back in 1929 when he wrote this. So then there's certain strategies within this area that would be a little bit different than this area. And so he's like trying so hard to have a map of social reform that is so much broader and deeper and more satisfying than just economic policies.
It's kind of a dark picture. So where do we go from here that brings us into the light a little more and helps us achieve this ideal as much as we can in the system that we're in?
No, that's a great question, and we've got to ask that question. And I like to reflect on the work of Joseph Pieper for this. To start with him, he wrote his famous lectures, which became Leisure, the Basis of Culture, in 1947. So that's 10 years after Belloc wrote his Crisis of Our Civilization. And here he is observing the crisis in effect, like after World War II. And he says, what do we do to rebuild our civilization? That's his question, Pieper's question. And in the end, he says, well, we have to understand the nature of our civilization, right? It's a culture. Well, what's culture based on? Culture is based on what he called leisure, following, ancient Greek roots. What that means for us, maybe a better would be like contemplation, like being prayerful or contemplative, being able to receive reality as it is without trying to distort it or interfere, right? And appreciate it and love it. Like beauty is the paradigm of this. Like we just want to receive it. That's all we want. And so that mentality, he said, and explains, is the basis of culture. But then he says, in a civilization which has lost touch with contemplation, that would be the civilization that wants to make everything, that's obsessed with work and technology and medicine and gadgets, and it doesn't want to sit back and pray and contemplate and write poetry, right? So he said a society that of total work, as he calls it. How do you get that back to care about leisure? How do you get it to be contemplative again, right? And he said the only answer is divine worship, right? So we need to restore feasting and festivals, celebrations. So we need the liturgical year. We need the traditions and the customs. We need the dress and the food. Like if we're doing that in public and we're celebrating something that deserves celebration, well, then we're necessarily contemplative. So contemplative doesn't mean like Carthusian. That's one way to do it. Contemplative might be, according to him, like partying and celebrating something worth celebrating, because now the object, right, of your celebration, let's say Christmas, for 12 days, you're partying, right? Then that shows the society and embodies the value of something worth contemplating that we didn't make, that we're just grateful for, right? That's the great Chestertonian starting point, right? Gratitude and von Hildebrand's is reverence. So you're like, well, there's got to be an object that we didn't make, that we appreciate, that we can see came from the Father above of all good things. And so I think that is the sort of way. And that's, so we don't just need to like be privately more devout. Now that's important. We can never get rid of that. We always need to be more privately devout. But if we are only privately devout, that's not going to address the societal problem. So we need to be publicly devout, which means public acts of worship. We need to do like in what happened here. The Eucharistic procession came through Steubenville, and it was beautiful. I was part of it. I'd never seen such a thing. I was raised Protestant, and I was literally inspired by the kind of faith that I saw, like all these people coming, all old people on their knees in the street, right? That can't feel good. The church absolutely packed. And saying these devotions and it being like filmed and being public, or like a procession of Corpus Christi, like this has to be done. And that creates what Belloc would call like a social form, an institutional change. So the spirit of Catholicism gets represented in an institutional thing, right? Rather than just our private devotions. Because if we only up our private devotions and not our public devotion, then we're just aiding and abetting the liberal view of religion, which is it's always privatized. You can believe in God, that's great. But you know what? The liberal order doesn't care. Like the educational institution doesn't care if you believe in God or not, it's irrelevant, right? The economic order doesn't care whether you believe in God or not, it's irrelevant, right? The political sphere doesn't care whether you believe in God or not, it's irrelevant. So it's what we call practical atheism. Your belief in God, the social order can take it or leave it. So if you have it, it's merely a private affair, right? Just like people that like bingo on the weekends, you like going to a Catholic church on weekends. And so we can't do that. We have to be public. We have to be social. We have to be communal. And so that is what I think is the solution. So that would be, that's not only like Benedict option and intentional Catholic community building, which those are awesome enough. Do those, right? Or returning to the land, do it if you can, right? But also like, look, we're in a state where we live in a modern state in a market system, which are technocratic inventions of sludge, right? Well, whatever. Play by the rules, be ethical, be moral, be virtuous, and do anything at any level of society to help out. Right? If you want to be a JD Vance, go for it, but be very careful, right? If JD ever hears this, right, be very careful with your soul, because the political environment will eat you, right? Unless you are protected by angels and prayers and many, many, many people caring about you, right? That will destroy your soul and corrupt you, right? Because the system, it's more like our system is more like a mafia, right, than like a completely legitimate government, right? And so we're in those rules. So we have to play by the rules so that we don't get killed. But it's not like the rules are just necessarily. It's not like they're right necessarily, but there they are. So if you can work within those rules to be able to change the system to make Catholic culture, go for it.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I think, we do our little part here in the Chesterton Society, and we encourage all of you that are tuning in, first of all, to rewatch this episode. Make sure you've absorbed all of it. There's a lot of great content here and seeds for that leisurely contemplation that you should be about. But also, we have resources to try to get together with your own communities, have a local Chesterton Society, have a local Rosary group. But as Alex says, we have to do it in such a way that is oriented towards man's call to participate in society. We can't become private about this. We can't just be individuals atomized from one another, because then we've bought in and we've let Hudge and Gudge win. So, Alex, it's we're just about at time, but this has been an absolute pleasure, and it gives me a lot of hope for the future that Steubenville, that Franciscan students are benefiting from this kind of discourse. And we'll have to have you back again, because I know there's 1,000 more things that we can talk about at length. So thank you for taking the time.
You are welcome so much. It was great being with you guys. Both very polite hosts, and I hope to come back again.
Absolutely, we will do that. And Grettelyn, as always, it's been a pleasure. I know we're lagging a little bit, but it's been a pleasure having you here as well.
Oh, thank you. Same.
And to all of you, our viewers and listeners, please make sure to give us that like, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, all these things. Share this with your friends. Make friends with Unjust Mammon. So use those tools that are out there. They may be inventions of sludge, but we don't have to just let bad people use them. We can share these things ourselves and get these good conversations in front of people and help them to think. Visit the links in the show notes to some of Alex's writing, information about New Polity. And please tune in again next time and invite a friend, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. God bless.